The most consequential developments in this conflict on May 9, 2026 are not happening in the Strait. They are not in the CENTCOM footage of smoking tanker smokestacks or the IRG radio warnings telling vessels to stay 10 miles from American warships. The most consequential developments are happening in the diplomatic channels that the Iranian regime has been running at emergency speed since the American pressure campaign transformed itself from a military operation into something more precisely targeted and more structurally dangerous, a direct test of every government in the world that has been maintaining ambiguous relationships with Tehran, and a demand that each of them reveal which side of a line they are actually on. Foreign Minister Iraqi's appearance in Beijing on May 6 was not a diplomatic success. It was damage containment dressed in diplomatic language and presented to the Iranian domestic audience as a sign of strength. The Chinese Foreign Ministry confirmed that Wang Yi received Iraqi in Beijing. The Iranian government confirmed that while in Beijing, Iraqi spoke by telephone with Saudi Foreign Minister Faisal bin Farhan to discuss the regional situation and maintain open channels. Read both of those engagements for what they actually are. A foreign minister of a regime under maximum American military and economic pressure flying to the capital of his country's most important economic partner and calling his country's regional rival from that capital not to announce victories, not to coordinate a counter-offensive, not to deliver demands from a position of strength, to beg for enough diplomatic oxygen to keep breathing for a few more days. Stay with me. Because what Trump's pressure campaign has engineered in the diplomatic domain in the past 72 hours is more strategically significant than any of the kinetic events in the Strait, and the analytical community is not giving it the weight it deserves. The tanker strikes and the naval clashes and the IRG's threats are the visible surface of this conflict, the diplomatic fracturing of the international network that has been allowing Iran to function despite for decades of sanctions. That is the structural story. And the structural story is moving faster and more irreversibly than the operational story. To understand what is happening to Iran's international support network right now, you have to understand what that network was and how it worked. For 47 years, the Islamic Republic survived the pressure of American sanctions and international isolation through a specific mechanism, the managed ambiguity of its relationships with governments that could not publicly support it but were unwilling to fully oppose it. China bought discounted Iranian crude and pretended the purchase was not a sanctions evasion mechanism. Russia maintained strategic coordination with Tehran and described it as a partnership of sovereign nations resisting American hegemony. European nations issued formal sanctions declarations while allowing financial institutions and trading companies to find workarounds through intermediaries. Gulf states that feared Iran's regional influence maintained quiet diplomatic channels that occasionally produced backdoor accommodations. Even American allies provided indirect economic oxygen to the regime through the specific mechanism of not looking too hard at where money was going and through whose accounts. This entire architecture depended on one thing: the ability of each actor in the network to maintain plausible deniability about its relationship with Tehran. A government that could not admit publicly to supporting Iran could still support it practically as long as the support was conducted through enough layers of intermediary that the connection was not directly documentable. The gray zone, the space between public condemnation and practical support, was where Iran lived and where the regime cultivated its most important relationships. Trump's pressure campaign has been systematically eliminating the gray zone, not by proving that specific transactions occurred, though the sanctions enforcement and asset tracking operations are doing that work in parallel, by forcing every government to make visible choices that reveal which side of the shrinking gray zone they are standing on. Who denies the United States' use of military bases for operations against Iran? Who runs to Beijing to coordinate messaging? Who calls the Saudi foreign minister to beg for regional diplomatic cover? Who arrests suspected IRG-linked operatives on their own territory? Who floats alternative international missions to avoid participating in American enforcement? Each action, taken in the current operational context, becomes a data point in the map of who helps Iran, who fears Iran, and who is trying to get far enough away from Iran before the cost of association becomes too high. Bahrain's arrest of 41 individuals accused of links to Iran's Revolutionary Guard is the regional security action that most precisely illustrates the broader diplomatic dynamic. Bahrain hosts the headquarters of the United States Fifth Fleet, the naval command whose assets are currently enforcing the blockade, conducting Project Freedom escort operations, and tracking every Iranian vessel in the Gulf. That geographic and institutional relationship means that any IRG-linked network operating on Bahraini territory is not just a diplomatic liability. It is a concrete operational threat to American naval operations conducted from Bahraini soil. The arrests are not an abstract expression of solidarity with the American position. They are the functional security response of a government that has decided or been shown evidence that makes the decision obvious that tolerating IRG-linked networks on its territory while hosting the American naval headquarters is not a sustainable operational posture. The 41 arrests carry diplomatic weight that extends beyond their immediate operational significance because of where Bahrain sits in the Gulf security architecture. A Bahraini government that arrests or linked individuals while the American Fifth Fleet operates from its territory is sending a signal to every other Gulf government about what active cooperation with the American pressure campaign actually looks like. It is differentiated from the merely verbal support that some governments have been offering, and it exposes every government that has not taken similar actions to a visible comparison with one that has. The Rubio intervention in Rome is the dimension of this story that the European coverage has been most reluctant to engage with directly. The Secretary of State stated publicly that some European nations, citing Spain, specifically denied the United States use of bases for an important mission connected to the Iran crisis. He described this as something that needs to be examined, because the utility of a military alliance depends precisely on the capacity to project force when a contingency appears. This framing is the most direct public articulation of the pressure that the Iran crisis has been placing on the NATO relationship since the conflict began. And it deserves to be read not as diplomatic complaint but as a strategic communication targeted at specific audiences. The primary audience is the governments that denied the base access Spain and whoever else Rubio had in mind when he used the plural before settling on Spain as the specific example. The message to those governments is not subtle. The United States is aware of the decision, is publicly characterizing it as a problem that needs to be examined, and is raising in the international diplomatic conversation the question of what military alliances are actually worth if they do not function during the specific contingencies that military alliances are supposed to address. Rubio is not threatening to dismantle NATO or withdraw American forces from European bases. He is doing something more precise. He is creating a public accounting for the decisions that individual members make about whether to support American operations against a threat that every NATO member has formally characterized as a threat. The secondary audience is every other government that is watching this exchange and calculating what kind of relationship it wants to have with the United States after this crisis ends. A government that denied the United States base access during an active military operation against Iran is a government that has revealed something about its own calculation, the calculation that the cost of cooperating with the United States was higher than the cost of declining, whatever the specific factors that produced that calculation. Rubio's public characterization of it makes the calculation visible. That visibility has its own effect on the government's future relationships with both the United States and with the other governments that are watching. The tertiary audience is the Iranian regime. The fact that some European governments declined to facilitate American military operations is, from Tehran's perspective, a small tactical success in the effort to create international daylight between the United States and its allies. The regime has been working throughout this conflict to amplify any sign of European reluctance, to present French and German and Spanish and British hesitation as evidence that the American position is not genuinely internationally supported, and to use that narrative to argue to potential diplomatic intermediaries that there is a viable path to a negotiated outcome that does not require Iran to accept American terms. Rubio's public treatment of the base denial as a problem rather than a vindication of the European position is the American counter-narrative to that Iranian argument. It frames the European hesitation not as wisdom but as a failure of alliance reliability that the United States will not simply absorb without commentary. The historical precedents that the current diplomatic campaign is activating are worth examining in detail because they reveal the pattern that Washington is deliberately replicating. Operation Staunch, launched by the Reagan administration in 1983, was specifically designed to destroy Iran's external logistical network during the Iran-Iraq War. Tehran was receiving weapons, parts, and military equipment through indirect channels, intermediaries, third-party countries, and gray market transactions that circumvented the formal embargo, and Operation Staunch was the systematic diplomatic and intelligence campaign to identify every node in that network and apply pressure to the governments and institutions that were allowing the transactions to occur. The target was not the weapons themselves. The target was the intermediary system that made the weapons accessible to Iran despite the embargo. The logic was that pressuring the intermediaries produced a compounding effect. Each intermediary that stopped facilitating the transactions forced Iran to find another, which required time and resources and produced a new target for the next round of pressure. The current American approach is operating on the same logic at a different scale. The blockade targets the maritime supply chain. The sanctions target the financial supply chain. The diplomatic pressure on bases and alliance relationships targets the political supply chain, the system of political cover and diplomatic ambiguity that has allowed Iran to maintain the narrative that it is not fully isolated, that powerful nations support its position, and that American pressure will eventually produce the same kind of fatigue that it produced in previous administrations. Cutting the political supply chain is the operation that the tanker strikes and the naval clashes and the economic pressure are supporting. If the political cover disappears, if every government that has been protecting Iran with silence has to choose between continuing that protection publicly and abandoning it publicly, then the isolation becomes real rather than nominal, and the regime's ability to use diplomatic ambiguity as a management tool for its domestic audience collapses. The Russia-Swift disconnection of 2022 is the more recent historical parallel that best illustrates the mechanism. When Western governments removed selected Russian banks from the SWIFT international financial messaging system following the full-scale Ukraine invasion, the effect was not primarily the immediate disruption to the transactions that could no longer process through SWIFT. The effect was the transformation of the relationship between Russia and every financial institution that had been maintaining normal business with Russian banks, because any institution that continued those relationships after the SWIFT disconnection was now doing so in a context where the political cost had been made explicit and unavoidable. The banks that chose to continue found themselves on a list that was visible to regulators, counterparties, and the governments whose sanctions they were navigating around. The banks that chose to exit found themselves on the right side of the political accounting that the disconnection forced. The same mechanism is operating on Iran's diplomatic and political support network. Iraqi's Beijing visit was not primarily about what Wang Yi said in the meeting. It was about making visible the decision that Beijing had to make in a context where American pressure was forcing every decision to be visible. China could receive Iraqi and did, but receiving him under these conditions produces the specific political record of a government that is actively engaging with a regime under maximum American military and economic pressure in the immediate aftermath of the bombing of Bandar Abbas and Qeshm Island, during the enforcement of a blockade that has sunk multiple tankers and is blocking over 70 vessels worth $13 billion in Iranian oil. That record is what the American pressure campaign is designed to create. Not a diplomatic rupture between Washington and Beijing that is not achievable on these terms, but a documented public accounting of where Beijing stands and what that standing costs in the relationship with Washington. The Saudi dimension is the one that reveals the most about the Iranian regime's actual regional position, because the conversation between Iraqi and Faisal bin Farhan in Beijing cuts against the narrative of Iranian regional strength that the regime has been projecting for decades. Saudi Arabia has been the target of Iranian influence operations, proxy attacks through the Houthis, and the sustained effort to use the IRGC regional network to undermine Saudi security and regional influence for 30 years. The relationship is one of the most adversarial bilateral relationships in the Middle East, not a cold rivalry but a sustained low-intensity conflict conducted through proxies, information operations, and political pressure. For Iraqi to call Faisal bin Farhan from Beijing to discuss the regional situation and keep channels open is the specific action of a regime that is trying to prevent its remaining diplomatic relationships from collapsing under American pressure. Riyadh's calculation in answering that call is not sympathetic to Tehran. It is the calculation of a regional power that wants to prevent the crisis from contaminating its own security environment and that has specific interests in not being blamed for outcomes it did not cause. Saudi Arabia does not want to be drawn into an Iranian military confrontation that the Houthis were conducting in the Red Sea and Yemen on Tehran's behalf for years, a confrontation that finally seems to be collapsing as the IRG's funding to the Houthis dries up under the blockade. The Saudi conversation with Iraqi is not support for the Iranian position. It is the management of a neighbor's crisis from a comfortable distance that maintains the appearance of regional diplomatic engagement without committing to anything that would cost Saudi Arabia in its own relationship with Washington. The regime interprets this differently for its domestic audience. A phone call between Iraqi and Faisal bin Farhan, presented through Iranian state media, is evidence that Iran's foreign minister is conducting active diplomacy with regional powers, that Riyadh recognizes Iran as a legitimate interlocutor, and that the isolation that Washington is trying to impose has not been achieved. The information architecture that maintains this narrative is the internet blackout that prevents Iranian citizens from accessing the outside analysis that would contextualize the call correctly. The call is real. The interpretation the regime constructs around it is the performance for an audience that cannot see the operational context: the 70 blocked tankers, the 45 square kilometer oil spill west of Karg Island, the 3 disabled vessels, the 41 arrests in Bahrain, the Rubio public criticism of Spain's base denial, the 8 unmarked aircraft over Zanjan whose cargo remains unexplained. China's position in this diplomatic picture is the one that carries the most strategic weight for the long-term trajectory of the conflict and deserves the most careful analysis. Beijing's willingness to receive Iraqi signals that China has not abandoned its relationship with Tehran. But the manner of the reception, the content that Wang Yi was willing to publicly confirm about the meeting, and the simultaneous public criticism that China's foreign ministry issued about Iranian military operations endangering Chinese citizens, these elements together describe a government that is maintaining its relationship with Iran, at the minimum required to preserve the relationship, while actively signaling to Washington that it is not willing to pay the cost of full-throated backing for a regime that is bombing Chinese-connected shipping. The Ocean Koi episode, the seizure by Iranian Marines of a Chinese-owned vessel carrying Iranian oil, is the operation a lone goal that has made China's calibration more difficult. China cannot maintain the studied neutrality it has been performing if Iranian forces are seizing Chinese-owned assets and endangering Chinese nationals. The political cost of silence about Iranian behavior directed at Chinese interests exceeds the political benefit of the studied neutrality that has been China's default position. So Beijing has been making a visible adjustment, public criticism of the maritime disruption, public expression of concern about Chinese nationals, continued quiet maintenance of the relationship through the IRGC reception that is designed to satisfy multiple audiences simultaneously with the minimum commitment to any of them. Trump's strategic utility of this Beijing calculation is the element of his approach that the coverage is not fully capturing. By forcing the Iran crisis to the level of visibility and urgency that the military operations have produced, the administration has made China's relationship with Iran undeniably visible to every government, market, and institution that is watching how Beijing behaves under this kind of pressure, the pretense of Chinese neutrality. That Beijing is merely an interested observer concerned about maritime stability and energy security is no longer maintainable at the level of detail that the crisis has produced. The U.S. government can now point to the IRGC reception in Beijing, to the Chinese nationals on Iranian-attacked vessels, to the Chinese company that owned the Ocean Koi, and to the Chinese energy purchasing patterns that have been the financial lifeline for the Iranian regime, and it can do so in a context where every government in the world is watching and making its own assessment of what China's relationship with Iran actually means. The Bahrain arrests, the European-based denials, the IRGC Beijing visit, the Saudi phone call, the Chinese public criticism of Iranian maritime operations alongside continued diplomatic engagement, each of these is individually explicable on its own terms. Assembled together, they are the map that the American pressure campaign has been designed to reveal, the map of who Iran's actual friends are, who its useful idiots are, who its afraid neighbors are, and who is trying to get distance before the association becomes too costly. The Banco Delta Asia case of 2005 is the third historical parallel that illuminates the current mechanism most precisely. The United States Treasury Department designated Banco Delta Asia in Macau as a money laundering concern for North Korean accounts. The immediate financial effect was the freezing of approximately $25 million in North Korean accounts, a sum that was, by itself, not economically decisive for Pyongyang. The actual effect was that financial institutions around the world, having seen a single institution suffer regulatory consequences for maintaining North Korean accounts, began proactively ending their own North Korean relationships. The cascading voluntary withdrawal of financial services from North Korea was not compelled by additional Treasury action. It was produced by the calculation of each institution that the cost of being associated with North Korean accounts had changed, and that the rational institutional response to that change was to exit the relationship before becoming the next designated concern. The same cascading calculation is operating on Iran's support network. Right now, the blockade that has trapped over 70 tankers and disabled 3 vessels in 8 days has made the cost of maintaining ambiguous relationships with Iranian shipping and financial networks visible in a way that the previous sanctions architecture did not achieve. The Rubio public statements about base denials and alliance utility have made the political cost of maintaining ambiguous relationships with Washington while quietly accommodating Iran visible in a way that quiet diplomatic management had been avoiding. The arrests in Bahrain have made the physical security cost of tolerating IRG-linked networks on Gulf territory visible in a way that their previous low-profile existence had allowed governments to manage. Each of these visibility events changes the calculation for every other actor in the network. The institution that was maintaining an Iranian-linked account is now calculating the likelihood that it becomes the next Banco Delta Asia. The government that was maintaining the ambiguous relationship with Tehran is now calculating whether the publicly documented version of that relationship after Rubio has named Spain and implied others is one it can continue to defend domestically and in its relationship with Washington. The country that was importing discounted Iranian crude through Ghost Fleet vessels is now calculating the risk of that relationship in a context where CENTCOM has been posting footage of Iranian tankers on fire in the Gulf of Oman and 70 vessels are blocked from Iranian ports. The regime in Tehran is watching all of this from behind an internet blackout that insulates its domestic audience from seeing the map as it is being revealed. The state media presents Saraki's Beijing visit as a diplomatic triumph. The arrest of 41 IRG-linked individuals in Bahrain is either not covered or presented as an American conspiracy to pressure a neighbor. The Rubio criticism of European allies is presented as American arrogance and alliance fracturing. The oil spill near Karg Island and the 3 disabled tankers and the blockade statistics are not topics that the information architecture is designed to present honestly. But the map is being revealed to the people who actually operate the network, regardless of what Iranian state media tells the domestic audience. The Chinese financial institutions maintaining Iranian accounts know the new calculation. The shipping companies that were registering Iranian-connected vessels under flags of convenience know what the CENTCOM footage of the Sea Star 3 and the Sevda means for their next contract negotiation. The European governments that denied base access know that their decision is now publicly documented in the record that Rubio has created and that future requests from Washington will arrive in the context of that documentation. The Bahrain government knows that 41 arrests have placed it visibly inside the American enforcement coalition. The Saudi government knows that the phone call from Iraqi was the Iranian regime calling to ask for help from a government it spent 30 years trying to undermine. The network is fracturing, not collapsing, not yet. The network that Iran spent 47 years building through the careful cultivation of ambiguous relationships and the patient maintenance of financial and political channels does not dissolve in days, but it is being forced into visibility one piece at a time. And visibility is the mechanism through which ambiguity is eliminated, and the gray zone that the regime has always depended on is compressed into the specific territory where choices have to be made and documented and lived with. Trump is not winning this dimension of the conflict by being liked, he is winning it by making the cost of the existing arrangements undeniable. The governments that have been managing their relationships with Iran through ambiguity are discovering that the ambiguity is no longer available at the price it used to cost. The price has gone up, some will pay it, most will not, and the ones who will not are the ones whose withdrawal from the network produces the cascading effect. That the Banco Delta Asia case documented and that Operation Staunch demonstrated, and that the Russia SWIFT disconnection illustrated in its own domain. Aragki flew to Beijing. Wang Yi received him. He called Riyadh from Beijing. The calls were made. The meetings happened, and none of it changed the map that the American pressure campaign has been revealing, the map that shows, with increasing precision, who is still willing to appear next to the Islamic Republic of Iran on May 9, 2026, and what it cost them to do so. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because the diplomatic fracturing of Iran's international support network is the strategic story that the kinetic events in the Strait are supporting, and it is moving faster than the daily coverage of tanker strikes and naval clashes suggests. Drop your prediction in the comments. Does the cascading visibility effect that the American pressure campaign is producing in Iran's support network reach the threshold where the regime's last remaining diplomatic relationships produce the specific demand that Tehran accept American terms, not because the relationships have broken, but because even remaining allies are no longer willing to absorb the cost of being associated with a regime that the map has made visible as isolated? And does Araki's Beijing visit represent the peak of China's willingness to appear publicly engaged with Tehran, or is it the beginning of a more active Chinese diplomatic intervention whose price is concessions from Tehran that Beijing will demand in exchange for protection? Stay informed, stay ahead.